Asnet. I'm the Assistant Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Programs, and we are so glad to see you here tonight, and you are in for such a treat. I've been interacting with our speaker, and you're just going to have a great time tonight. We have books that are going to be sold over here in the left corner, right corner for you, and after the interview, there will be time for Q&A. I'll remind you, please, to turn off your cell phones. And now the Dean of the College of Journalism, Diane McFarland, is going to introduce the program and the speaker.
Thank you, Gail, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We are very excited about our speaker tonight. Debbie Cenziper is part of our Great Storyteller series, and she is an investigative reporter, Pulitzer-Prize winner, and also an alumna of our college, and as of last week, a professor. She is now on the faculty of George Washington University, so a lot of connections with the University of Florida. Debbie represents the best of investigative reporting. While at the Miami Herald, she worked for more than 5 years. She received the 2007 Pulitzer-Prize for local reporting for her investigation of housing corruption. She was also named a 2006 Pulitzer finalist for her series exposing breakdowns in the nation's hurricane warning system. At the Washington Post, Debbie has reported on nonprofit groups that failed to provide services for people with AIDS, and on the government's troubled housing construction program for the poor, which led to changes in federal law. Forced Out, which exposed dangerous conditions in rent-controlled apartments, was awarded Harvard University's 2009 Goldsmith Prize for investigative reporting. Most recently, Debbie co-authored a powerful book, Love Wins: The Lovers and Lawyers Who Fought the Landmark Case for Marriage Equality. Famed Watergate reporter Bob Woodward said this book is, quote, a real winner and expertly crafted. You can tell it's going to make a great movie, and I couldn't agree more. I just finished it. Love Wins tells the very moving story of the people behind the groundbreaking 2015 Supreme Court case, Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. Her forceful narrative is an unforgettable account of how a grieving man and his lawyer introduced the most important gay rights case in U.S. history, which resulted in a decision that was as groundbreaking as Roe v. Wade and Brown v. Board of Education. Through insider accounts and access to key players, Debbie reveals previously unreported events behind this case. We are so pleased that she's here today to talk with us about creating such deeply engaging work. Please note that we are live streaming in this event, so as Gail said, if you would, please turn the volume, your phone ringers off, but don't turn your phones off, because we would love for you to tweet from this. The more that we can share this story with others who aren't here, the better. And please use the hashtags Debbie Cenziper, DebbieCenziper, and Great Storytellers. Here is Great Storyteller Debbie Cenziper with another star of our college, Professor Mike Foley.
You should enjoy that. Some of that's for you.
It was very nice. Thank you.
How is the book doing? I know we're going to have record sales tonight, but how is the book doing?
The book was released all over the country and in some other countries in early June, just in time for the one-year anniversary of this landmark Supreme Court ruling. And it's done very nicely. I'm proud of the literary success that the book got. We've had great reviews in the Washington Post, in the Miami Herald, and in other papers. So the book is holding its own. It's doing very well in airports for some reason. I'm not 100% sure why that would be, but for some reason we're just flying off the shelves in airports. But I'm very proud of the fact that other writers like the book.
It's a terrific book. It reads like a legal thriller, like John Grisham. It's really, I recommend it highly. How did the book come about?
So I have been an investigative reporter for 20-some years at major daily newspapers, most recently at the Washington Post. And I have been focused on corruption and crime and greed and the bad things that people do, often with the government's money. And this was a story about love, and it was a story about family, and it was a story about empowerment and what ordinary people can do, and did. I mean, they took this case in record time to the US Supreme Court, and they did it to protect the people that they cared most about. And that really moved me. It moved me as a journalist, it moved me as a human being. It just touched me. And I read about the case in my own newspaper, the Washington Post. And so 3 months before the Supreme Court even ruled on the case, I took an unpaid leave of absence from the Washington Post. Thank goodness my editors were supportive. And I said, I want to tell this story. And I had no idea which way the case was going to go, which way the Supreme Court would rule. Obviously, I had a better book if they ruled in favor of same-sex marriage. So, but I would have written the story either way. And so that's how it got started. I happened to know the named plaintiff in the case, Jim Obergefell, through distant family connections. And I called him up and I said, would you trust me enough to tell the story? And luckily he said yes.
Terrific, terrific. That's how you got together with Jim.
That's how I got together with Jim. Now, Jim, is arguably the most well-recognized names and faces in the LGBT community. And so it was definitely an effort to collaborate because he was traveling all over the country and I was huddled up in my home office trying to, write this book in 6 months. But that's how the whole thing got started, yeah.
He's become a gay rights icon.
He really has, and he's an interesting man. Like most heroes, if I'm allowed to use that word, he was just an ordinary guy living out his life in Cincinnati, doing some IT work. And his life was his husband. I mean, his life was his longtime partner, John Arthur. And they spent 20 years together living in this super conservative community. At one point, Cincinnati was considered the most anti-gay city in the country. Cincinnati actually passed a law that prevented the city council from enacting any laws that would protect the gay community from discrimination. So they wouldn't even allow a law that would protect the gay community from discrimination in housing or the workplace, let alone same-sex marriage. And Jim was never really involved in these political issues. He was in love with his husband and living his life. And then one day when his husband was in his 40s, they weren't married at the time, his partner John was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And just before John died, they decided to get married. Now, they couldn't marry at the courthouse 8 blocks away because Ohio banned same-sex marriage. And so Jim actually chartered a medical plane and flew his husband to Maryland, where same-sex marriage was legal. That would be easy for us, but it wasn't easy for them because John was in the final stages of ALS. And literally every movement, every bone in his body hurt. He couldn't even wear his wedding ring because the weight of it hurt his fingers. But they wanted so desperately to get married before John died that John agreed to take this trip to Maryland. And they married on a tarmac at an airport outside of Baltimore. And when they flew home, they were so happy to call each other husband. For years they called each other partner or significant other. But husband was a totally different word. And words matter. They really do. And so every night they'd go to bed, I love you, husband, or wake up, good morning, husband. And they were constantly using this word. And then a civil rights lawyer in town, met them and said, I hate to talk about this because who thinks about death certificates when you've just gotten married? But do you know, John, that when you die, the state of Ohio will list you as single on your death certificate. And they will not list Jim as your surviving spouse because the state does not recognize your lawful wedding in Maryland. So here you had 2 men who were in love, 2 men who were together for 20 years, Jim refused to put John in a home in the later stages of ALS. He's worked from home. He took care of John through everything. They went to such great measures to get married, and suddenly they were told that their marriage wasn't recognized by their home state. And that's when Jim stepped out of his private life and took on this issue.
Your description of this disease is painful to read. How did you go about researching that? That was a very moving part of the book.
Thank you for saying that. I was lucky enough to interview the neurologist who diagnosed John with ALS, and he was a fascinating man because he's been in a wheelchair for years and years and years and suffers from muscular dystrophy. And he described to me what it's like to watch patients newly diagnosed with ALS who are standing over him, standing up and talking, and this doctor's in a wheelchair, and the doctor knows that eventually they'll be in wheelchairs too. And so he was able to describe the progression of this disease and why there is no cure. And of course, Jim was able to describe, what it was like to just hear from John one day saying, yeah, my left foot is kind of dragging behind me. I'm not sure what it is. And they thought maybe it was all kinds of strange things like lead poisoning. And it turned out to be ALS, which is a death sentence. And that's in large part why they decided to get married.
Moving forward. How long did it take to write this? You were kind of under the gun.
So I was under the gun. The decision was on June 26, 2015, which is a big day in the LGBTQ community because there was a decision 2 years earlier in 2013 that was very groundbreaking at the time called the Windsor decision. And that Supreme Court decision forced the federal government for the first time to expand the definition of marriage to include same-sex couples and then deliver to same-sex couples all the benefits that come with marriage. And those of us in the heterosexual community might not think it's a big deal, but there's more than 1,000 benefits that the federal government provides to married couples, pension and disability and all kinds of stuff. So there was this groundbreaking ruling on June 26, 2013, and then Obergefell v. Hodges was decided on June 26, 2015. So of course my publisher wants to publish in June of 2016 in time for the 1-year anniversary of this landmark decision. And so I had about 6 months to report and write 80,000 words. I was actually reporting and writing as I was going along, not necessarily knowing what the next chapter was going to say. And of course, my editor was saying, send me the next 5 chapters. And I'm thinking, are you kidding? I mean, I didn't even know what the next chapter was going to say. And we had some added pressure because we were lucky enough to have 20th Century Fox option this book before it was even written, because they're hoping to develop a feature film based on this story. And so I was reporting to my editors at HarperCollins as well as to 20th Century Fox. It's just a little bit of pressure there.
Wow. You started talking a little bit about the writing process. How do you work? Do you work differently on a book than you do on your investigative work?
I loved writing this book. It was actually life-changing for me because I felt so free to tell the story. I felt it was a love story, and I was so moved by it. And when you're an investigative reporter, you're bound by, there is, a certain formula that we use. We tell both sides of the story. We incorporate data. We incorporate statistics. This was a love story, and it was a story not just about John and his late husband Jim and their 20-year love affair, but it was also a story about parents and their children, because there were other plaintiffs involved in this case, and they were same-sex couples who went to great lengths to adopt children or to have babies. All they wanted was to start their family, and they found out that they couldn't get birth certificates that listed the names of 2 mothers or 2 fathers because their home states did not recognize their marriages. So can you imagine going to such great lengths to have children and doing all the things that we do as parents to protect our children and to protect our families, and then being forced to decide which parent's name to list on a birth certificate and which parent's name to keep off? effectively that parent became a legal stranger in the eyes of their state. And so I just loved writing about the way ordinary people, parents living in cul-de-sacs in Ohio and Michigan and Kentucky and Tennessee, stepped out of their busy lives to protect their families. And so the writing process was just absolutely delightful because I was so inspired by the people I was writing about.
A quote from the book: "Some of the most successful civil rights cases have started with a story." You say that twice in the book.
I did.
Expand on that.
Well, the leaders of the gay rights movement early on decided that they would not take a case to the U.S. Supreme Court for same-sex marriage unless they had won over the hearts and minds of the American public. You don't get more than one good shot at the Supreme Court. As you know, they take very few cases. And they wanted this to be the strongest, best, most well-timed case that they could take to the Supreme Court. And so they met, the leaders of the gay rights movement, in 2004 in a hotel room off of I-95 in New Jersey. And they said, what's it going to take to win marriage in this country? And they had all kinds of strategies, but their biggest one was to win hearts and minds. They had to have the American public behind them. And they thought it would potentially take years because expanding the definition of marriage is a big deal. It's a big deal. And they didn't know how long it would take, and it turns out it happened in record time. The public was ready for it. And I think the public was ready for it because the gay rights movement told stories about regular people like John and Jim. And they told stories about the kinds of tangible, technical problems that same-sex couples faced on a regular basis. As a journalist, I followed the issue of marriage equality, but it always seemed symbolic to me. Like I kind of got it, and I was thinking, okay, this makes sense, but it didn't really hit me in the gut until I realized that loving and committed same-sex couples could not get birth certificates for their children. And until I met those couples and watched, there was this one couple from Kentucky, and they're on the steps of the Supreme Court during decision day, and it's literally a life-changing day, but their toddler wanted to throw pennies in the fountain in front of the Supreme Court. So these two moms with diaper bags are running after their toddler. And then this same-sex couple, Michael and Greg, also from Kentucky, have teenagers, and they're sitting inside the halls of the Supreme Court. You could hear, it was incredibly silent because in the Supreme Court, you can't even sniffle. Don't cry, because the clerks will tap you on the shoulder and tell you to shush. And they brought their teenagers inside the Supreme Court, and Justice Kennedy is talking about his decision, and one of the teenagers' mouth kind of whispers to the dad, "Did we win? Did we win?" And the dad goes, "We won, we won." And it's just these little universal moments that we can all relate to. This wasn't a book that was written just for the LGBT community. It's a book about universal experiences and universal emotions and things that we all understand and we can all feel.
I think that little growling sound is your neck rubbing your mic.
Well, sorry. Let me move my mic. Okay.
Glitch solved.
Thank you, thank you.
As a journalist, I've told you this several times today, I was impressed with the detail in the storytelling. The details like what was the decor of the adopted kid or the kid's bedroom. What was the weather like on various big days in this? What was the menu on the after party after the wedding? It was different for each of the in-laws. And the two dogs owned by one of the lawyers in the case, Biscuit and Carlos, were named. How did you do that?
Well, I did it by asking lots and lots of questions, and thank God I've been a journalist for 20-some years. I aggravated all of my sources, asking them questions. What were you thinking? What were you wearing? What was he thinking? What was she thinking? Was it hot? Was it cold? What kind of car were you driving? On and on and on. And I went back almost 40 years in this book. So people got a little bit frustrated with me, and a lot of the men would ask their wives, and it was, all kinds of crazy stuff. But I just asked a lot of questions because I did not want this book to read like a history book. Didn't want it to read like a term paper. I wanted it to read like a story, like a narrative. I wanted the readers to feel for the people in this book. And one of the ways you can feel for the characters in this book is if you relate to them. And so if I describe the two dogs that were members of a wedding party, in this book, well, we get that because we love our dogs, If I describe a bedroom painted blue because it's a teenage boy and he's got, video game posters up, well, we get that because that's the way teenage boys' rooms look. And so I did it by asking a lot of questions, but strategically I did it because, these are real people here with real families and real stories, and I wanted readers to be able to relate.
It was an excellent job. Just
Thank
an
you.
excellent job.
Thank you.
Talk about the lead lawyer a little bit, who had an incident in his youth where his father was dismissed from a company, and
Yeah.
and he always felt that he would fight for injustice, against injustice.
Yeah, and I've said this many times, but I live in Washington, D.C. and work there, and there are lots of very slick, high-priced lawyers that I've run into, and the lawyers in this book were exactly the opposite. They are what I would call true believers. They are just die-hard civil rights lawyers that gave up everything to make this case. I mean, one lawyer in Michigan actually sold her family's home because she needed the money to keep this case going, and she did. I mean, these lawyers had clients with a problem, and they were determined to solve it. And Al Gerhardstein was John and Jim's lawyer, and he grew up on a chicken farm outside of Cleveland. And he watched his father work the farm. He worked for a corporation, and he watched his father work the farm, and his father was so proud of his job. And he was laid off without a pension and without any severance. And Al felt like this was not fair and this was not right. And so he got a full ride to NYU and became a civil rights lawyer. He could have gone anywhere. He could have gone to Wall Street, could have gone anywhere, but he went back to Ohio to practice civil rights law. And he represented Planned Parenthood back in the day when there were bombings of clinics. And he represented his brother, who was a gay man, in a case in the 80s, and he lost. Al also fought the city of Cincinnati in the 1990s when the city decided that there would be no laws allowed that protected the gay community from discrimination. Al spent 5 years working on that case, fighting for the gay community without pay. Took it all the way to the US Supreme Court and lost. And he was devastated. He was so devastated he thought about quitting law. I mean, it was like suddenly the world didn't make sense to him, and law didn't make sense to him. And he almost shuttered his practice and became a professor somewhere. God forbid.
Heavens.
But he didn't. And so when he thought he had a case for same-sex marriage, he was nervous about taking it on because he did not want to let down his clients. And he had suffered a loss, a significant loss earlier in his career. But he went through with it anyway. And the interesting thing about Al is, when the case finally made its way to the US Supreme Court, this is obviously a chance for Al to argue before the US Supreme Court. It's a dream job for a lawyer. Everybody wants to argue before the Supreme Court. And Al is a brilliant lawyer. And he stepped away from, he decided not to do that because the other lawyers involved in the case wanted to bring in a more experienced lawyer from Washington, D.C. And Al could have fought it. He could have said, I started this case, I've been arguing this case, I know how to handle this case, my plaintiffs love me. But for the good of his clients, he stepped away at the last minute and allowed someone else to argue the case before the Supreme Court.
Did these lawyers ever get paid?
They got paid in civil rights work, federal civil rights law. You only get paid if you win. And if you don't, you don't. And judges decided at the end of the day, this case involved 4 states, and judges in 4 states ultimately decided what their fees would be. But these lawyers, I mean, these were not big name lawyers. I mean, One group of lawyers in Kentucky, I mean, they struggle to keep the lights on. I mean, their offices are butting up against railroad tracks and bus stops, and they're looking for clients at the courthouse. These are not big-name lawyers, and they really struggled for the 2 years. And then they had to wait to get their fees paid, but they eventually did get paid.
I was worried about that.
They got paid.
They were really hurting.
Yeah.
Let's diverge a little bit from the book for a second. You're kind of a crusader yourself, like Al, the lawyer, about injustice and unfair things and crooked things. Talk about your Pulitzer-Prize winning story. I found that fascinating earlier today.
Yeah. I get nervous at the word crusader. I know we kind of are, but I get a little nervous. But yeah, I guess that's what we do. So I was in Miami, and I've always been interested in writing about people who don't have a voice, people who don't have power, and people who are hurt when the government safety net fails. And so I've written a lot about, poor people, minority communities, women's issues, children's issues. And as I was driving to work in Miami, I saw this empty lot covered in beer cans and overgrown weeds and trash everywhere. Not a big deal in Miami, there is some of that. But there's this big sign in the middle of the lot that said, Miami-Dade Housing Agency funded project. And I thought, well, what are they actually funding here? Because all I see are trash and beer cans. And so I decided to look into how much money Miami-Dade's housing agency had been paying to build homes for the poor, and where that money was going. As journalists, we follow the money. And I found out that the housing agency had invested tens of millions of dollars to build hundreds of homes for the poor, funneling the money to a series of private developers. And in many cases, the developers built nothing. They walked away and built nothing. And one of the victims in this story was a lady named Ozzie Porter, who I will never forget because her picture is on my mantle next to the little Pulitzer-Prize piece of crystal you get when you win a Pulitzer. And she reminds me every day about why I became a journalist. And Ozzie was a cafeteria cook, making minimum wage for years. This was her job. And she saved $5,000 on a cafeteria cook's salary to put down as a down payment on one of these homes. And she did it because she was raised in public housing. Her children were raised in public housing. Her grandchildren were raised in public housing. And she wanted to get out of public housing and do right by her family. And so she put down this $5,000, her entire life savings, on a cafeteria cook's salary, got the architectural plans for her new home, and was so excited she had them laminated, and she stuck it on the coffee table of her home. Of her public housing unit. This was everything to Ozzie. And that developer walked away without building, took her money and ran. And what we found through the reporting was that many developers diverted the money for their own use. One guy built a 13,000 square foot mansion for himself, complete with a spiral staircase and a billiards room. The house was so big and so sprawling, we sent a photographer up in a helicopter to take a picture from the air because it was just this unbelievable sight. Another developer had a thing for watermelons. I think he had farmed watermelons at some point. I never quite got to the bottom of that. But he ended up buying this sculpture of a slice of watermelon. And it's as big as this stage. It was huge. We got a picture of it. And this was money meant for the poor. And so we told Ozzie Porter's story, and the stories of other victims, and the stories of these crooked developers. And our story was in print for a couple of hours, and I know you've both experienced this as editors, when the mayor responded immediately. He fired the entire management team at the housing agency. At least a half dozen, 10 people lost their jobs. The federal government, HUD, U.S. Housing and Urban Development, came in and took over the housing agency. At least, I think, 3, 4, maybe 5 developers went to prison. We were there for their perp walks, kind of watching that happen. But the best thing that happened, we had overnight protests on the steps of County Hall and candlelight vigils, the whole community. I've never seen a community come together like this. I've never seen it. It wasn't just the advocacy community. It was the whole community. People were angry. That's what journalism does. That's what good journalism, accountability journalism does, is it shines a light on problems like this. And, communities care and communities respond, and that's what happened in Miami. But the best response we got was Habitat for Humanity came in and offered to build some of these houses in the city of Miami. And just before I left Miami to go to Washington, these houses were going up, and they were all over. I mean, you could just see house after house after house after house. And Ozzie Porter finally got her house. And I was there the day she got it. And it's a day I will never forget as a journalist, because she was walking from room to room, like just crying. I mean, she's running her hands along the counters. She's looking at the walk-in closets. She's looking at her garage. She even had this little fountain in her front yard. This was her first home. It was the first thing she could call her own. She had gotten out of public housing. And she actually waved the keys over her head and shouted, "Hallelujah, hallelujah." I will never forget it. And so I've got her picture on my mantelpiece because it reminds me of the power of the press and why I became a journalist.
Excellent story. In the book, there's quite a debate in trying to persuade the judges to overturn laws that had been enacted by a public vote. How did they combat this "let the voters decide" argument?
Yeah, there were, the people who opposed same-sex marriage, or the judges who ruled against it, weren't necessarily bad people. The judges believed that the voters had enacted these same-sex marriage bans, and that the court system should not step in and overturn something that had been enacted by the voters. Ohio's voters in 2004 voted to prohibit same-sex marriage. 3.3 million people voted to prohibit not just same-sex marriage, but even the recognition of lawfully performed marriages in other states. That's how far Ohio went with this issue. And so some judges in this case believed that it wasn't their place to overturn, a law that had been enacted by the voters. And that's what they argued both at the appeals court level and at the Supreme Court level. Now, the other side argued constitutional rights were being violated. And that trumps everything. And ultimately, that was the argument that won. That the will of the voters doesn't count when a fundamental constitutional right is being violated. And that's what was decided in this case.
I thought that was fascinating. You even had one person assigned to defend against this lawsuit,
Yeah.
whose heart really wasn't in it.
Yeah, I'm a journalist. I go to the other side, and the other side in this case was an assistant attorney general in Ohio named Bridget Koontz. And she just happened to be working at 4:30 on a Friday when this lawsuit was filed. And it was kind of an emergency order, and there would be a hearing in federal court the following Monday. So she had less than 48 hours to prepare for her to defend the state's same-sex marriage ban. So she had 3 young children at home. Her husband was a cop working all kinds of hours. And her boss was Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine, who had publicly come out against same-sex marriage for years. And she was told, you know what, we've got this case, it's just come in. So Bridget had less than 48 hours to prepare to defend the state in this case. But what was interesting was she personally supported same-sex marriage. So now you've got this young lawyer who has to defend the state's same-sex marriage ban, even though she personally supported same-sex marriage. And she was horribly conflicted by this. But at the end of the day, she felt like it was her job to defend the state and the will of the voters in Ohio, and that's what she did. But for a fleeting moment in federal court, she thought about standing up and saying, "I'm Bridget Koontz on behalf of the wrong side of this courtroom." I was really happy to get Bridget on the record in this book because it just, there's not necessarily good guys and bad guys. People are people, and she was an interesting character to write about. She really was.
You mentioned earlier that you had access to 2 just judges, 2 federal judges.
Yeah.
That's highly unusual.
Highly unusual. I was so thrilled that 2 sitting federal judges were willing to talk to me. You know, we often don't know why judges rule the way they rule. We read their orders, but we don't know about them as people, you know? And these 2 federal judges felt so strongly about same-sex marriage that they broke protocol, a bit of protocol, to step out and talk to me about it. And one of them was the federal judge in Cincinnati who first ordered the state of Ohio to issue accurate birth and death certificates for Al Gerhardstein's same-sex couples. And it was interesting. What he told me was, and this is a whole scene described in the book, he adopted a baby girl, he and his wife at birth, adopted a baby girl who is now an adult. And every year on their daughter Abby's adoption day, this judge and the judge's wife would sing a folk song to their daughter called Oh Happy Adoption Day. And so even when she was an adult, they would call her on the phone on her adoption day and sing this beautiful folk song. And so this case about birth certificates and adopted parents who adopted, who wanted to protect their kids, meant something to this judge because he personally adopted a child. And so he did 2 things that nobody knew about when it was happening. First of all, he waited to release his order, forcing the state of Ohio to issue birth certificates that were accurate to same-sex couples. He waited to release his order about 5 or 6 days because he wanted to release it on his daughter's adoption day. And so he did. And the second thing he did is at the very back end of his 48-page groundbreaking order, he listed the words to that Oh Happy Adoption Day song for everyone to read. And so judges, you know, it was just a very, very interesting story. I've never really talked to a sitting federal judge who, you know, told me why they ruled the way they ruled. We have another judge in the book, Judge Martha Daughtry, who is one of the only female judges on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, 1 step below the US Supreme Court, so a very powerful judge. And her whole background is the first woman this, the first woman that. She was a real trailblazer for women. First woman at Vanderbilt Law School for a while. I mean, just unbelievable. And she compared the struggle for same-sex marriage to the struggle that women face to gain the right to vote. And she said, you know how long it took women to gain the right to vote? She asked in court one day, and the poor attorney for the state had no idea, was like horrified. And she just pressed him, do you know how long it took women to gain the right to vote? And he's trying to answer and he can't. 78 years, she said. It took 78 years. Why did we have to wait that long? Why should same-sex couples have to wait that long? You know, the will of the voter be damned. Why should same-sex couples have to wait that long? And so after oral arguments at the Sixth Circuit, she was on a panel. It was Martha Daughtry and 2 conservative judges, or judges appointed by Republican presidents. And she took off her robe in the robing room of the Sixth Circuit, and she sat down prepared to fight for this case because she wanted to end it at the Sixth Circuit. And she said to her 2 colleagues, you know, these men were in love. Please, these men were in love. And she pleaded, and she pleaded, and she lost. And she lost. And because she lost, that created a split in our federal circuit court, and it ultimately sent the case to the Supreme Court. But she fought, and her decision, her dissent in that case was so scathing, it was read around the world.
Fascinating. I think you mentioned in the book that this story changed you. How?
Oh, it changed me in so many ways. I think it softened me a little bit. You know, when you write about corruption and greed and crime and theft for a long time, you kind of, it just, you know, it's hard after a while because we call it in journalism kind of low-hanging fruit. I mean, wherever you look, you find it. And this story softened me because I really was just so inspired by the characters, the people in this book, and what they did to protect the people they love. I really was just so moved by them. And I think, you know, it changed my career path a little bit because I think I'm interested in writing a second book also about some kind of social justice issue. And so It was a labor of love to write this book. I didn't take a day off, a single day in 6 months, and I enjoyed every minute of it. I really did. And I told both my children I want them to become civil rights lawyers. We'll see.
And get paid.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. If you would, please come to the microphone, because we are streaming this and taping it, and or well, I guess you don't tape anything anymore. We're digitizing it. And you're welcome to please state your name.
My name is Steve Summer, and you mentioned the will of the people several times. And to me, every time you said that, this big religion bubble came up in my head. And I'm just wondering, did you touch on that at all as far as
Religious exemptions and things like
well, and also what drove a lot of this, what drove a lot of the people, had to do with religion.
Yeah.
And just
That was-
curious.
It's an interesting question, and it's a good one. That was not an argument made by the people who oppose same-sex marriage, interestingly enough, in this case. In Ohio, they only argued one thing. They argued that it was a democratic process, this is the will of the voters, and we have to respect the will of the voters. Other states argued, do same-sex couples make good parents? We don't know if same-sex couples make good parents. They kind of moved into the more volatile issues about same-sex marriage. But religion didn't come up too much in this particular case. It was more, who are we to expand the definition of marriage? In fact, at the Supreme Court level, one of the justices says, well, what was the definition of marriage in ancient Greece? Let's talk about the history of marriage and the definition of marriage. And I remember Al Gerhardstein was saying, he's like, what does ancient Greece have to do with this kind of a thing? But it was more an issue of, this is the will of the people, we have to respect the democratic process, and then it expanded into the more volatile issues of same-sex.
And I apologize, I may not have asked my question properly. I understand that and recognize that, but I was wondering, the will of the people, when people voted, what went through the,
Why did they vote that way?
Yeah, they voted that way because of religion. Most people did.
Yeah, I don't know why they voted that way, but I can tell you that they voted in Ohio and I think 12 other states in 2004 because Massachusetts that year, after years and years of court battles, legalized same-sex marriage, right? And there was a huge backlash by many members, many leaders of conservative leaders in this country. And so because same-sex marriage became legal in Massachusetts, there was this huge effort all over the country to embed these same-sex marriage bans in state constitutions. And that's exactly what happened. I'm not sure why voters did it. We can all speculate why they did it, but there was an organized effort, state by state, to ban same-sex marriage in 2004. And ultimately, those bans were overturned by the Supreme Court last year.
Hi, my name is Sterling Davenport, and I am actually a historian who studies LGBT issues. I graduated from here last year. And I know that, as you said, many laws were passed in the 1990s and before that precluded any recognition of LGBT rights in Cincinnati and cities around, and actually in Gainesville in 1994, a similar ordinance was enacted. But at that time, many lawyers wanted to bring a case and argue for marriage because they saw, as you did, as you noted, that there are something like 1,100 rights that adhere to marriage at the federal level. So they said, why don't we just go for the whole thing? And people said, no, we'll lose because it's too big. Now, I know even in 2013 with Windsor, that was a concern, and in 2015, it was still a concern. So did you experience any pushback when you were interviewing people about that? The various gay rights leaders that you spoke to who didn't want to bring marriage because marriage, one, it's a difficult question, and two, it sort of elides the differences and the struggles that gay people of color face, and people of a lower socioeconomic status. Marriage is sort of the be-all, end-all of white heteronormative gay people who just happen to be gay. But I appreciate your book, though.
Thank you. You're exactly right. I mean, the leaders of the gay rights movement wanted to take it step by step. And the reason they wanted to take it step by step is because of the backlash that they faced in 2004 when Massachusetts legalized same-sex marriage.
In 2003, we legalized same-sex
That's true too. Progression, yeah. No. Yeah, he's talking about the Lawrence decision at the U.S. Supreme Court that overturned sodomy laws. And, you know, this was a progression of gains for the gay community that many people did not like, and it made a lot of people very nervous. And so there was this backlash. And so to answer your question, leaders of the gay rights movement were ready to take a same-sex marriage case to the U.S. Supreme Court. And they were ready because all reputable polls by CNN, the Washington Post, and others showed that a majority of Americans supported same-sex marriage. They had won hearts and minds, and they were ready to take this case to the U.S. Supreme Court. What they were nervous about was whether they should take this case to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so Al Gerhardt-Stein and other civil rights lawyers did get calls in this case saying, are you sure this is the right case to take? Are you sure this is the one you want to try? And the reason that they were nervous is because the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals is a more conservative court in this country. And they were worried about a very high-profile loss when cases in other circuits were being won. I mean, all over the country, same-sex marriage cases were being won. And so the lawyers in this book faced pushback, all kinds of pushback in the beginning. And you know what they said? We have clients with a need. We're moving forward with this case. And ultimately, they were successful.
Don't be shy. Well, she's not shy. I've known her for a long time. She's not shy.
Diane McFarland. Debbie, sitting here listening to you, I'm struck by, you are an exemplar of what is best about journalism, and at a time when the basic tenets of journalism are violated every day. I think you really do exemplify why journalism is so important to any society, and particularly to a democratic society. Could you tell your own story? What brought you here? What really influenced your decision to go into this field? And was it something that you knew early on in your life you wanted to do? And have you had any regrets?
I knew I wanted to become a journalist my sophomore year of college. I transferred to the University of Florida, got involved in the J School here, and walked into the independent Florida Alligator one day and never left. I mean, I think I was there for 3 straight years. Between the professors I had at the J School here and these incredibly driven, smart young journalists at the Alligator, I knew that this is what I wanted to do. And, you know, very early on in my career, I experienced the power of the press. I think I told the story once today, but when I worked at the Charlotte Observer in North Carolina, I was a very young journalist, and I wrote about uninvestigated and violent deaths in state-run psychiatric hospitals, including deaths of children. And they were people who died from homicides, suicides. They were scalded in hot bathtubs. They starved to death, horrific deaths. And I tracked these deaths. And as I was driving home one day, I got a call on my cell phone, and I was told, please hold for the governor. I had never talked to a governor. I mean, I was 25 years old or so. And my hand started shaking, and thankfully I pulled over to the side of the road, and the governor got on the line and he said, young lady, I made notes in the margins of your story. And I'm thinking, my story? You read my story? And he immediately hired, I think, 24 safety inspectors and pumped millions of dollars into children's mental health care. And I will never forget, I mean, that was such an extraordinary thing for my work and my words to prompt that kind of change. And I was hooked on investigative reporting really ever since. But I started here at the Alligator. You know, I personally grew up in the malls of New Jersey. I mean, the big hair and the whole thing. I never grew up reading a newspaper. My father read the Philadelphia Inquirer every single day. I never did. And I remember very distinctly walking into the newsroom at the Alligator and these incredibly smart and socially aware kids. And I honestly couldn't have told you the difference between a Republican and a Democrat. when I started. I mean, I was as clueless as they come. And I got my education in that newsroom and here at the University of Florida at the J School. And I don't have any regrets. I really don't. You know, our industry has evolved, as we know. It's gone through all kinds of incredibly difficult cuts and budget cuts and layoffs and buyouts and all of those horrible things. But the need for content is still there. And the need for stories and books like this is still there. And I don't think that that's changed and will change. I hope it doesn't change. In fact, you know, I saw Spotlight this year. Did you all see Spotlight? And the executive editor of the Washington Post is Marty Baron, who was portrayed by Liev Schreiber in the movie. And I walked out of that movie cheering. And I hope you all did too. I think it's this generation's All the President's Men kind of a thing. I just felt so good about journalism when I walked out of that movie.
Hi, my name is Joe Corder, and I publish Gainesville Iguana. And I've kept my journalism local here, putting on our paper. I don't know if you ran across it when you were a student, but we're going to be celebrating 30 years of publishing here in town. And I just wanted to thank you for carrying on your work and getting into activism and merging your ability to write with super good causes. And I just wanted to just quick relay what happened here in Gainesville was our clerk of the court started issuing licenses as soon as possible. One of our churches set up outside the city hall and they were conducting marriage ceremonies. And what I witnessed there when I was there to photograph it for our paper of everything from a couple and a couple friends getting married to whole families there. It was so real, so genuine, and so overdue. So thank you very much. And you know, we carry on as we do, but it's really important to get the word out.
Yeah, that's so nice to hear.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's funny at book signings and events I'm doing all around the country, all of these couples come up to talk to either me or to my co-author, Jim Obergefell, and they're so happy and so joyful. They want to introduce their spouse, and they say, "This is my husband. This is my wife." They couldn't say that before, and words matter. Mm-hmm. They really do. And I always say, "Oh my goodness, when did you get married?" "Well, we got married right after the ruling. We got married the day of the ruling." So I always say, "Well, you're newlyweds. Congratulations." And more often than not, they look at me and they say, "We're newlyweds, but we've been together for 30 years."
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's just love. It's just love, and it's just commitment.
Yep.
Thank you.
One more. I think this will have to be the last one. You get the last word.
Hi, I'm Roxy Patton. I'm the Director of LGBTQ Affairs here at UF for a whole month. And I'm from Ohio, so everything you're saying, I'm like, oh, I know about these people.
Yeah.
I voted for some of these people. But ultimately, I've been doing social justice education for years, and one of the most powerful tools I tell people all the time is storytelling. Mm-hmm. And so I've been collecting stories to share, and I'm curious in your experience, because, by the way, I love the book. If you heard stories, if other stories emerged that you found yourself wanting to explore, but kind of felt like you had to stay in the book, and what are some of those side stories that you've experienced that maybe you've wanted to explore but hadn't had the opportunity?
So I stopped the book. The book ends the day of the Supreme Court decision. There is an epilogue, but it really ends the day of the Supreme Court decision. It ends on a high note because it was just a perfect way to end the story. But so much has happened, as we all know, since then, with issues about bathroom laws and transgender rights, discrimination against the transgender community, the hate crime in Orlando. The hate crime, the Pulse nightclub shooting, happened 2 days before we published this book. It was just devastating. And it would have been nice if I had some time to explore what's next. You know, it's important, I think, for the gay community to pass a federal anti-discrimination law. And everybody is working on that. So if I had more time, and if I expanded my timeline one more year, I would have explored those issues, because the gay, you know, the LGBTQ community will tell you the fight is not over. Not over by far.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we'll end on that note. Thank you very much, Debbie. It was terrific.
All right,
Great.
fantastic.
we have copies of the books. She's happy to sign them for you over there in that corner. Cash is acceptable, but a card is preferred. So get your cards out and get your books. And thank you very much for coming.